So the question is, how would you describe your state's efforts to expand access to quality, affordable childcare for working caregivers? And the options are excellent. My state is leading on this issue and recognizes that investing in childcare is necessary to advance racial equity. Good. My state has enacted policies / taken action to expand access, but more work needs to be done. Fair. There is interest in expanding access, but little to no action has occurred. And the last option is this is not a priority for my state, but I would like it to be. So if you could finish taking the poll in the next minute, that would be great. And for those of you who just joined us, we're completing a poll that asks, how would you describe your state's efforts to expand access to quality, affordable childcare for working caregivers? And the options are excellent. My state is leading on this issue and recognizes that investing in childcare is necessary to advance racial equity. Good. My state has enacted policies / taken action to expand access, but more work needs to be done. Fair. There's interest in expanding access, but little to no action has occurred. And the last option is this is not a priority for my state, but I would like it to be. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and show everyone the results. So as we can see, no one chose excellent, which is my state is leading on this issue and recognizes that investing in childcare is necessary to advance racial equity. 53% of people chose good. My state has enacted policies / taken action to expand access, but more work needs to be done. 41% chose fair. There is interest in expanding access, but little to no action has occurred. And 6% chose this is not a priority for my state, but I would like it to be. So now I'm going to turn it over to our panel to begin a discussion. And if we could start with Alexa and just get your initial reactions to the poll results.
Thanks, Brianna, and hello, everyone. It's so great to be here and speaking to you all on this very important business issue and very important policy issue. Honestly, looking at that poll, I think that wasn't surprising to me. I think that a lot of folks would fall within that good, fair category. I think if we had the issues solved, or if we were all leading and everything was hunky-dory, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. So, it's what to be expected, at least in this stage. And I'm really excited to continue this conversation, and really kudos to everyone who's joining this conversation, because I know that you are leaders in your own spaces and going to be able to lift up this conversation and bring it back to your own states to get us bumped up more towards excellent too. So thank you all.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I also was not surprised by the results. And I just want to echo what Alexa said about everyone being leaders in their states and able to address this issue. Ray and Alicia, do you have any thoughts on the poll results?
Alicia, I'll let you go first if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Mine's going to be really quick. I think that, like Alexa and Brianna stated, I don't think it's really surprising that many states were in the good and the fair category. I think that speaks to mostly a lot to do with the moment that we're in, understanding what states are doing, understanding the racial reckoning that's happening, understanding all the movement that's gone around racial equity in the country. And I guess to even take that a step further and thinking about how states are reacting to this and implementing plans, I would encourage people to think about who are involved in these planning periods, what communities, what stakeholders are involved in this planning, and what that looks like across those communities, and how they feel states are doing in terms of implementing racial equity policy and looking at how that's supported through childcare. I would just add that quickly.
Yes, and I will just mention that I wonder how many of those who took the poll are from southern states. Certainly, southern states have a long way to go in making progress on this front. I'm glad to be in a state in Georgia that we made some fair, or you can call it good progress, good recent progress in what we've done on the child care policy front. But, so much further to go. And, with Southern states being so far behind, many others, it's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done.
Yeah, that really resonated with me, Ray, when you talk about the need for additional advocacy. And Alicia, I really appreciate your comment about thinking about who people are engaging when trying to address this issue. And so let's start with you, Alicia. Why should states invest in childcare? Specifically, why is investing in childcare necessary to advance racial equity?
Yes, thanks so much, Brianna. Those are really great questions. And so I did want to first just kind of quickly note that while state investments in childcare are critical to expanding access and advancing racial equity, these investments have to be supported at the federal level. Robust federal investments are needed to create sustained, adequate, and equitable system of funding that treats childcare like the public good that it is and always has been. And in fact, when federal investments are not sufficient, it really forces states to make really difficult decisions, such as reducing spending in other adjacent programs that children and families who access childcare supports often rely on. But to your original question, states should invest in childcare because accessing and affording appropriate types of high quality care as defined by individual communities, individual families and collective communities is critical for family and community economic stability, as well as children's well-being and development. And something that Alexa briefly touched on is that these investments are also critical for employers and business owners to reduce staffing and work interruptions. And so switching to kind of connect these points to racial equity, it's really important to understand why investments in childcare is a racial equity issue. You have to kind of take a step back and understand how the present landscape of systemic barriers, particularly for communities of color, are related to foundational historic policies rooted in racism. And so we look back and we see generations of race-based exclusionary policies, segregated and underinvested systems of education, workforce development, community development, health, you name it, particularly within Black and Indigenous communities. And these underinvestments have created structural and systemic barriers that require robust, targeted state investments to equitably expand access to childcare. And this is especially so within communities of color who also have low incomes. And so just further connecting those two pieces about investments in racial equity, it's important to keep in mind that when states lack adequate investments to fully support the range of childcare needs for all children and families, savings often come at the cost of creating restrictive eligibility parameters and provider supports to save money, which often disproportionately impacts communities of color. And so these restrictive parameters limit the full flexibility of federal parameters and can be related to such things as how work requirements and definitions are, how work requirements are set up and along the lines of definitions of eligible activities. It can look in terms of family redetermination requirements and job search limits, and the list can go on. And so I will add this as well, that investing in childcare is also necessary to advance racial equity because such investments could allow for increased wages, access to paid family and medical leave, and medical benefits for childcare and early educator staff and providers who are disproportionately women of color and who often are earning poverty level wages and rely on these supports themselves. So I think those are some spaces where I think that there's a lot of critical importance to invest in childcare as a whole, but why it is also important to do so to advance racial equity.
Thanks so much for that, Alicia. And I really appreciate you uplifting the point about the federal investment and how important that is for states, because I know that's something that a lot of our members are interested in. I also really appreciate you addressing the pipeline issue and how to fully address this issue, you also have to address the pipeline issue. Ray and Alexa, do you have anything to add on to what Alicia has said?
Ray, you can go first.
Sure. It's it's so much has been said already, but and I'm really just kind of repeating a good bit of what's been said, but it's still important to say that policymakers must address childcare as a public good, because it serves as the backbone of economic prosperity for our current, emerging, and future workforce. And we can't claim to support gender or racial equity without embedding solutions that secure comprehensive childcare infrastructure within our economic policy strategy. So, when we think about getting women back into the workforce, it requires that we build the care economy that has been needed for decades, let alone just the pandemic recession. And in order to do that, we must build a robust childcare and early learning system that ensures that when women or other caregivers take time to care for their families, they can do so and not suffer grave reductions in income or permanent job loss.
Those are really good points, right? I'll put in my chamber hat and kind of speak on behalf of the work that I do representing employers, though. And I think that childcare investments and the conversations that I have both with my members, but businesses statewide and other business organizations is, look, this is childcare investment. I think, especially given the circumstance of the world that we live in today, can be such a critical tool that we can use for racial equity and allowing everyone to be able to fully participate in the workforce. So when we come back bigger and better and stronger, and our communities can do that, and all of our folks that are traditionally put on the sidelines are able to participate in our economy and be able to upskill themselves and better provide for their families and their kiddos too. And so that's the take that I put on it from a childcare investment conversation. I think that it's just a really important tool. And then the conversations that I have with business leaders themselves, especially when we talk about knowing that this circumstance has affected more women and more people of color, just saying, as business leaders, what does this do to your culture? And are we willing to let this affect our culture if we don't have women in leadership positions, if we don't have people of color in leadership positions? I think that it begs a much larger conversation, and something that I think that I've been able to have conversations with business leaders, and it spark multiple light bulbs, because I think that this is a multifaceted issue. And so that's kind of the way that I've been talking about it, both with business leaders and then other business organizations across the state of Michigan.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Alexa. I think I really like the way that you framed it around a tool. I feel like using that language can be really effective when advocating for investments. So now I want to switch to talk about some of the barriers that you all have touched on. And Ray, I think we'll start with you. What are the biggest barriers that states face when trying to expand access to childcare for working caregivers?
Sure. Well, I would say it starts with a lack of political will to prioritize this type of investment into our workforce. And by political will, and I think I'm in the best position to say this, men, we need to get on board by supporting systemic solutions that intentionally create gender and racial equity. And then furthermore, I would say, our state, in Georgia's lack of political will to prioritize the health and well-being of its workers, particularly for those who work in low-wage industries. And we've seen this by example in our state and many other states, premature cuts to pandemic unemployment protections for the involuntary jobless, particularly the program that served jobless part-time workers and independent contractors, which was, the pandemic unemployment assistance program, PUA, which included assistance for many of those who were in our child care workforce. And last, I would say, it's the harmful impulse among lawmakers to turn to austerity cuts during economic downturns, instead of a more balanced fiscal approach. Simply put, austerity cuts are systemically racist and the antithesis of equity. In Georgia's most recent fiscal actions, and I'm sure there are a number of other states as well, but Georgia in particular, demonstrated a desire, to cement these austerity cuts across most state agencies, which pose a challenge to creating long-term investments that can expand childcare access.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The point you made about it being around will and building will among people who have the power to influence investments in childcare. Alicia and Alexa, do you have anything to add to what Ray said?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think Ray made some really great points. I don't want to touch on any of those. I think they stand perfectly as is. I guess I would take a closer look in terms of what happens within states, going back to the idea of planning, understanding how states implement, parameters and regulations. I would say that a limited and unevenly distributed supply, workforce supply of providers and early educators is also a huge barrier. And part of that barrier is really incorporating the wide variety of providers into systems. So while we all are probably very familiar with center-based care and home-based care, there's a lot of what people refer to as family, friend, and neighbor care or informal care arrangements that many families rely upon, especially families of color, families with low incomes rely on these types of providers. And so in order to expand access to childcare, we have to expand access across provider types. We have to make sure that there are pathways and supports to allow a variety of provider types into the system so that families are receiving the types of care that are appropriate for them and that meet their needs in terms of their employment status, their work hours, language, and a lot of other components. So I think that's a huge barrier, is really states wrapping around getting in line with the idea that providers come in many different types and forms, and we have to create access that is equitable to meet families' needs.
Those are all really good points, Alicia. I think that I would just add, again, just from my role within Michigan and representing businesses and representing my West Michigan businesses at the state capitol too. I've been really fortunate. I think that Michigan has been really fortunate. I want to give Michigan credit where credit's due as far as political will. I think that we've had some really great recent wins here in Michigan, and I think that they've been done in a very bipartisan fashion, which in today's world is something that makes me happy, makes my job a little bit easier when we're able to really have one of those bipartisan issues that we have really good leaders both in our administration and our legislature to say, this is important. This is important for Michigan communities and families and business. We do have a divided government. We have a Democratic governor and a Republican-led legislature, but they were able to work together most recently to pass $1.4 billion for childcare funding in our state through the American Rescue Plan. I think that does a lot of really great things, and so that was something that we saw them prioritize when it comes to the American Rescue Plan dollars and incorporate it into our fiscal year 2022 budget. And so I was really proud of the work that Michigan leaders have done in a bipartisan fashion. Do we still have tons of work to do? Absolutely. I'll be the first to say it, but I want to give credit where credit's due to our Michigan folks.
Thanks for that, Alexa. Alicia, I really appreciate you uplifting the importance of options for caregivers and creating pipelines for those options. And Alexa, we're going to talk soon about the great work that Michigan has accomplished. But I want to pivot to discussing a little bit about federal funding. Specifically, this is a question for you, Alicia, given your expertise. What federal funding streams are available to states to expand access to childcare for working caregivers? Specifically, how can states leverage the flexibility of the federal funding to expand access to working caregivers?
Yes, I'd love to dive into that. So the Child Care Development Fund is the main source of federal funding to support states in expanding access to childcare. And through those funds, there's the Child Care Development Block Grant, and these funds are used to support parents and caregivers who have incomes at or below 85% of state median income, who participate in required eligible activities, and who have children under age 13, with some exceptions for children who require special services. And so the first way states can fully leverage the flexibility of federal funds is by states investing the full amount of required state funds to access the full amount of federal funds. So states are required to put up a certain amount of matching and maintenance of effort funds. And so when states don't put up those full amount of funds, they risk not being able to access the full amount of federal funds. And so to that point, of course, adequate federal investments are needed to maximize state flexibility. And so to leverage those funds to expand access, states can really look at their requirements and guidelines and really make them go beyond minimum and max and to meet federal maximum thresholds when they're developing and implementing state plans and requirements and parameters. And so I touched on this briefly when I previously when I talked about restrictive parameters around work requirements and eligible activities. And so using job training as an example of how states can leverage funds to expand access. While job training is an allowable activity at the federal level, as of 2019, 7 states don't allow job training as an allowable activity. And so this ultimately restricts access for working caregivers in these states. Another opportunity to leverage the flexibility of federal funds in the way that really meets the federal parameters and goes at least to that level is by states updating provider payment practices to increase economic stability for providers caring for children supported by CCDBG. And so current federal guidance and recommendations set, these are recommendations, not requirements, but these recommendations set payment rates at about 75 at the 75th percentile market rate, which means that families would have enough funds to access 75% of available childcare providers in their state. But many states do not set their payment rates at this level. They set them much lower, and having payment rates that are so low really creates disincentive for providers to accept families who are using subsidies because of the subsidy amounts do not match the cost of care. And so an opportunity to go beyond this recommendation would be for states to really update those payment rates to at least get to that 75th percentile rate, but to go beyond that, states can also do away with market rate calculations because market rate calculations are more reflective of a parent's ability to pay the high costs of childcare, especially those high costs associated with infants and toddlers. And instead, payment rates could reflect the true cost of care, which incorporates what it actually costs to provide childcare instead of what parents can afford to pay. And so this can include such things as like adequate living wages for providers and early educators, which is critical, as we talked about, to building the supply of providers. And so in addition, expanding access to working caregivers also means ensuring, as I touched on again, diverse types of care are included in the system. And so that's critically important. And some of those considerations to those types of provider that can be expanded, that access can be expanded to and incorporated into the system are providers who offer non-traditional work, non-traditional hours of care, or who provide just-in-time care for parents who get their schedules maybe a week in advance or even a day or two in advance, and they need to quickly find care. Also, having providers that have cultural and understanding parents' cultural and linguistic preferences and understanding the types of care needed for children who have specialized needs. And so I think that's these are really important. And Alexa touched on this briefly. Many states have gone to expand those parameters to meet federal requirements through ARPA and additional funding through emergency and federal relief funding. And those expansions are being put into place and they're really helping families, but we need to move towards a more permanent process to expand these parameters and these eligibility flexibilities that are offered at the federal level that states can implement through their state plans and how they operate their programs.
Thanks for that, Alicia. I really appreciate you uplifting the importance of making sure that job training is an eligible activity, and also the importance of ensuring that care is culturally and linguistically competent, because I think that's very important for advancing racial equity. So now I want to pivot to discuss some of the state wins that states have recently had. And I guess we can start with you, Alexa, and the TriShare program in Michigan. So can you please tell us about the work in Michigan to expand access to childcare to working caregivers?
Sure. So what seems like forever ago, but it was just in the summer of 2019, the Grand Rapids Chamber pulled together a statewide coalition focused on childcare. And our goal was to really lift up the business voice. So my intention was to bring in more and more business organizations and folks representing business, along with key state leaders, legislators, traditional children advocacy groups, research. And the goal is to be strategic in trying to figure out what to focus our energy in to move the needle with childcare, wanting to really elevate the business voice and challenge employers to really lean into this issue too. And so that was the kind of understanding of getting all of these folks together. And what we decided to do and decided to pinpoint on was what became known as the Tri-Share pilot program, which splits the cost of childcare between state, family, and business. And it's about roughly a third from each. And there's really three major pillars that I talk about when I talk about the Tri-Share pilot program and its importance, at least in this beginning iteration of implementation. The first is that in the current setup now, we have three pilot programs really in one. One's in a rural, one's in a suburban, and one's in an urban setting within Michigan, because we all know that childcare looks so differently between those regions. There's also the idea of a facilitator hub, and that would be an entity within the region that would apply to be a part of this, Tri-Share pilot program that would have to demonstrate that they have really great connections to both employers in the region and childcare providers, and really work to be that liaison and connect supply and demand, and also help with the administrative burdens that we know are all too real in our childcare providers, but then also helping businesses get employees this benefit too. And so it would be voluntary. The third pillar is it's voluntary for businesses. They can elect to be in this pilot program, and the idea is that they would be able to offer this benefit to their employees up to 250% federal poverty level. So we were really targeted with it. When the time that we were developing this, we set at about 150% federal poverty level in Michigan. So between that 150 and 250 were those folks that we knew were sitting down, number crunching, trying to determine whether it made sense to do what. Can I continue working? Can I continue to upskill and better provide for my family? Or should I stay home because childcare is just too much of an expense? It doesn't make financial sense. So that was kind of the idea that we had. We were able to get it funded. I would not recommend asking for $1 million in a pandemic, but we certainly did it. And that was a very stressful time, but obviously it worked out, and we sat in a pretty good position, I think nationally too, as far as revenue and resources. But we were able to get this into the budget. We are now implemented, and there's the 3 regions across Michigan. Those are really great to see, and we're getting employers in and employees in. It's relatively early in the implementation process, but one thing that I'm really excited to say is that we have all business sizes and industry types represented already in the early iteration, which was really nerve-wracking to me, because I didn't want it to be, this was only for big business, or this was only made sense for a certain industry. And so that was something that the coalition was really intentional on. Okay, if we see that, then how are we going to respond? But at least the beginning data is showing that we're good, and businesses of all shapes and sizes and types are able to participate in this and see value in it. So we were really excited. We actually just within the fiscal year 2022 budget that was just passed and signed into law last week, we got allocated funding from $1 million to $2.5 million. So really excited to see that major increase in investment, and was really championed by a Republican in the legislature in West Michigan, who wanted to see this happen, because he had the same conversation with his wife over the kitchen table about childcare and what that looks like for their family. So he was our champion among others. And then obviously have a great friend within the governor's office, and with the governor herself. Governor Gretchen Whitmer has been a tremendous advocate, and also her whole administration. So really excited to see, all fingers crossed. Like I said, it's a pilot. We are expecting problems from pilots. That is to be expected, and we'll work through it. And the coalition's really excited to continue to implement. And we also know, again, this isn't a one size fits all. This is not the silver bullet. This is just one more tool in our toolbox that we're able to utilize here in Michigan. So none of us are around the table saying this is going to solve all issues. It's certainly not, but I think it's a really great way to bring in the business voice and have them be able to invest in their workforce.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Alexa. I think Michigan's Tri-Share pilot program is an excellent example of how states can creatively try to address the cliff effect as well. A follow-up question I have for you that I think would be our Blue members would be interested in is, how are you successful in getting business on board to this idea?
So so I can answer this question a few different ways. So I think the pandemic really highlighted, at least from where I sit, a lot more folks saying, calling me up saying, hey, this is an issue for me. And I'm like, well, we've been saying it for years now, but I'm glad that you're on board now. So it was kind of slow for some, but I think that the more that folks were able to talk through, how this affects their workforce, the more conversations that they had with their employees, because that's what was really big for me, especially the employers who this wasn't on their radar whatsoever. The pandemic hit, and I was saying, talk to your employees, ask them what are issues, have that honest dialogue. I think that there was a time pre-pandemic where that just simply wasn't an honest dialogue. Employers weren't aware of it, or they didn't have a full understanding of just how it affects their workforce and showing up and being able to work. And so I think that the pandemic really highlighted it. I think that more and more employers are saying that this is a key barrier, and it's really great. We thought pre-pandemic, this would be a really great talent attraction and retention tool. I think that it's being utilized even more so, saying, obviously everyone's fighting for the good talent that's out there, to be able to say, hey, this is something that we're participating in. We know this is a barrier. This is what we're doing. And this is a benefit to you, I think speaks volumes about that employer too, and how keen they are to their workforce. So I think a lot of employers see it really now more than ever as a really key talent attraction retention tool, which we're really excited about.
That's awesome. I love the framing of it around a talent attraction and retention tool to get more employers on board. So shifting from Blue to SkillSpan, Ray, can you please talk about Georgia's recent policy wins and how that fits within the state's larger strategy to expand access to childcare for working caregivers?
Sure. Well, over the last recent months, and within this pandemic, over the last maybe year and a half, there have been some good things and some policy wins that have happened in Georgia. And one of them include using CARES Act relief to increase Department of Early Care and Learning funding, DCAL funding, for Georgia. During the height of the pandemic, DCAL created new slots for children of essential workers and provided $1,000 bonuses to each child care worker. And then just announced by DCAL just a few days ago, they released their spending plan for ARP funding, which will distribute more than $800 million for child care stabilization grants and more than $600 million for child care development block grant funding. And this will include expanding their CAPS program, the Child Care and Parent Services Program, by increasing the number of children served in the state by 10,000, raising the entry income threshold from 50% of the state median income to 85% of the state median income. Along with that, raising the poverty thresholds for priority groups. And when we think about, getting CAP scholarships, you have to be, in that priority group really in Georgia to be able to get that type of funding for child care assistance. And with that, as far as the poverty thresholds, they've been raised from 50% of the federal poverty level to now 150% of the federal poverty level. So that's a huge deal for Georgia and for families with children. And also, DCAL increased the quality rated tier bonus payments to child care providers to help them to improve their quality of care. And they're going to provide child care workers with 2 additional $1,000 bonus payments in 2022 to mitigate worker retention efforts. I mean, there's a lot more that needs to be done, but these are certainly big steps as far as temporary ways to comprehensively provide more child care access in the state. And this is going to be up to year 2024. And then one other thing, this is going to include, implementing an upcoming stakeholder engagement project. Think about how can we have more long-term state strategies, beyond just the federal funding that we have. And then, just moving on to other wins that we've had, paid parental leave for state workers. Georgia lawmakers passed HB 146, a number of months ago in our last session, which provides 3 weeks of paid leave for eligible full-time state employees welcoming a new child to the family through birth, adoption, or foster placement. And on this here, it's especially critical for childcare providers who are employed in the public sector, many of whom are at higher risk of COVID infection and spread. Many of those are, those of color, Black, Latinx, older, have pre-existing conditions, or immunocompromised. This pay leave policy that we have now, it also benefits state workers with children who need to take leave or care for their child's needs and not lose critical wages that support their household, including childcare expenses. And then more particularly, it benefits those in our state public sector who work in low-paid public service occupations, who otherwise would find it difficult to afford to take unpaid leave when they or their children are sick. But there's still so much more to be done when we think about getting into a broader state strategy. Just within this paid leave policy that we have now, we must ensure that strong regulations are issued. We must make sure that Georgia workers understand their new legal rights. We also have to make sure that state agencies comply with their responsibilities and that adequate enforcement mechanisms are in place so that this new law can work as it was intended. And then paid leave must be expanded to have more weeks of coverage, more than just 3 weeks. That way families can adequately cover and support their caregiving needs. And then just thinking even further, these recent wins in childcare access, as far as or at least temporary childcare access, temporarily expanded childcare access from DCAL and the paid leave policy that we have, these are foundational steps, on a path to expand paid leave provisions that can ultimately serve Georgia's public and private workforce, that can expand childcare access for low-income earners in the state while lifting pay for childcare workers, and that can serve as a precedent to scale supportive work-family policies to more southern states. And then, furthermore into the larger state strategy that we have. We're looking to advance policy proposals that set enforceable standards to end overly rigid and unpredictable scheduling practices that are common in low-wage industries in Georgia, as well as improving our workforce development infrastructure by offering 2 generational approaches, as we want to call it, that serve both the child and student parents, who seek to train or retool themselves to acquire better jobs. And in terms of workforce development, lack of affordable childcare in Georgia also presents a massive barrier to completing post-secondary education for far too many Georgians. So we must continue advocacy in this 2-generation approach that I speak of. And just another point about that, the last point about that is, when we think about the extreme cost of childcare in Georgia, it's nearly impossible to afford both an education and childcare without student aid and childcare assistance. So, there's certainly a need to, and just getting more deeply into that, we were proposing and have proposed to braid, certain funding streams to be able to support both, and as a result, even before I say that, students often have to find jobs with hours that make it difficult to manage full-time caregiving at school. And, more of those jobs that they take on in school, they often pay low wages. And, when employment is unreliable, let me say it a better way, when unemployment is driven by unreliable scheduling, it often has few hours, it becomes nearly impossible for working student parents to plan for childcare and graduate in time or finish a degree. So, there are avenues that we hope to have, advanced, in our upcoming legislative session, to braid, TANF funding, with child care assistance funding, particularly for those who lose child care assistance once they're looking to pursue a 4-year degree. So in Georgia, you can receive child care assistance when you're enrolled in a technical college, but once you try to pursue a 4-year degree, that child care assistance goes away. So, braiding TANF funding to be able to fill that gap that's lost for those who seek a 4-year degree to train or retool themselves, that can certainly be a way to brave funding that can serve the parent and the child.
Thanks for providing an overview of all the policy wins that Georgia had, and talking about how states can think about braiding funding to expand access to quality, culturally competent childcare. A follow-up question I have for you is, what advocacy strategies did you use to achieve these wins that you think might be useful for other coalitions to be aware of?
Sure. Well, I mean, I will say it's certainly GDPI, we certainly can't take the credit by ourselves. When you think about, and I'll just start, because it's one thing, when you think about, paid leave, and then another thing when you think about, the childcare access wins that we have, you think about paid leave, the paid leave, the movement towards that, is come from a number of years. And this is something across many southern states that seek to, provide just more equitable standing, for public sector workers. And in Georgia particularly, there's been a huge movement to, to expand, access and just the economic well-being of our teachers. So with that, that certainly provided, a great bit of leverage to be able to get to the point, along with, what's taking place in the pandemic, for Georgia to get to the point where they would provide, a paid leave policy that we have right now, which is a foundational policy that we want to build on to bigger things. And then when it comes to, as far as strategies, when it comes to the childcare expansion of childcare access, while we certainly, would like to believe that, the research and the advocacy work that we've done when it comes to gaps in childcare and what's that, and the negative impacts that's had, from a racial equity and gender equity standpoint in Georgia, has had, an influence, or it's certainly, pushed on, or pushed, state lawmakers, or pushed, our governor to make moves on that. I also think I have to be honest in thinking that, it's not just, us or other advocacy groups that we partner with that have had just these really successful strategies to just push them over the top. I think there's also just, the governors and other state agency executives understanding that, if we don't provide these type of at least, temporary or short-term investments in childcare access, it's going to have some huge consequences for our state's economy, because we still, as many states do, maybe even all states, have a number of specific worker shortages, as you could say, in certain industries, for a number of reasons, but childcare is certainly one of the biggest ones. If we don't shore up, so I'm sure that our leadership in the state believe that without us prodding them, without our influence, without us doing more than we already are doing, to inform the conversation on that, they saw that if we don't do this, there's going to be, huge losses that we take, in the progress that we made, in the recovery so far in Georgia.
Yeah, I really appreciate you emphasizing the importance of childcare being part of an inclusive economic recovery. And so before we go on to our audience Q&A, my final question for you all is, other than the aforementioned strategies, what steps can states take to ensure that working caregivers have access to culturally competent quality childcare? So just hearing some last thoughts from you all. And if we could start with Alicia, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first steps states can take is to ensure that definitions and measurements of quality include measures such as cultural competence, language needs, and discipline and behavior management. And perhaps one of the most important steps is to develop these definitions and measurements in consultation with working caregivers, early educators, and providers, especially those from within communities of color who have historically been excluded from policy development and decision-making spaces and processes. And so I think that's really important to get to the point of how we define quality, what that looks like, how those definitions are incorporated into systems, and what they mean to the families who are the ones who say the quality that they want, but also as well to providers, and understand what quality looks like from their perspectives, and understanding that quality can look very different across communities, but that does not mean that because it looks different, it's less than. So in addition to these definitions and standards and measurements, they should also accommodate a range of needs and values, as I was just talking about, within individual communities with respect to how they may vary, how these needs and ideas and values and quality differs across race, ethnicity, language, geography, income, and at intersections of these factors. And so when we really take a look at what we think of as quality now, often the standards and the measurements and requirements around who and what qualifies as providing high quality care can be really narrowly defined. And these narrow definitions don't always incorporate, again, language preferences, discipline and behavior management, culturally competent curriculum, culturally competent interactions, et cetera. And so they're often devoid of these different factors. And sometimes those factors that look different across communities and the strategies to get to those, to what quality looks like for those families really is penalized. And when it's not traditional ideas of quality, these providers find it very difficult to move in increasing quality to be defined or labeled as high quality providers and to move up in like quality rating improvement systems of tiered measurements of quality. And so I think that's really important to think about who is defining quality, what community members or stakeholders are included in developing systems of quality and defining those things. And I think to that end, we can't talk about children and families without providers. Another important step is for states to adequately invest in quality building activities, supports, and resources that accommodate the range of needs across provider types and settings and create practical and appropriate quality improvement pathways, again, across provider types. And so that's also just going back to the equity conversation that, oftentimes providers operating within systems where they can support families who use subsidies, they have to also operate within systems of quality rating improvement. They have to operate within quality rating and improvement systems. And so it's really important for a wide range of provider types to be able to have pathways to increase quality so they're able to serve those families, and families aren't forced to either forego supports and just trying to make other arrangements, and they really can use those supports that are available to them in ways that are appropriate for their needs.
Thank you for sharing that, Alicia. I particularly appreciate your focus on quality, not only defining it and kind of pushing against some of those traditional ideas of quality, but also investing in ensuring that you can support other entities to achieve whatever that definition of quality is. Alexa, do you want to share your final thoughts?
Sure. And again, wearing my chamber hat, our childcare providers are small businesses. More often than not, they're women-owned businesses, and more often than not, they're minority women-owned businesses. And so I think with that lens, we have to be able to really rally behind them and support them, because our larger business community relies on a really strong childcare industry. And so everything that we can do to support them as business owners and small business owners, we must do for the health of our overall economic security, stability, and for our next generation too.
Thanks for that. I think it is really important for people to remember that a lot of childcare providers are small businesses and minority owned and women owned businesses. Ray, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure. I will just say, I'll just say that, what we're in right now, what so many states are in right now, as far as, and unequitable, recovery, it's not going to get better until we address this issue. While there are other things that are taking place that are part of that recovery, unequitable recovery, this is a huge part of it. And until we do something about it, we're going to see, these, worker shortages or labor shortages that we knew all along did not have, well, I'll say it a better way, that research has shown, time and time again, it did not have, they were not significantly, affected by, unemployment pay, but it was a matter of, public health issues and a matter of a care economy that has just been decimated, and it's been made worse from where it's already been. So until we address this, we're not going to get, further along in the recovery. And it's going to be, you know, suffering on both ends. And it's going to be obviously suffering when we think about, you know, people first and their prosperity first, but there's also going to be suffering, you know, across employers and industry, because they're not going to be able to find, you know, an adequate skilled workforce to carry us into recovery.
Thank you. And thank you all for your comments and insights. I know that I've learned a lot just listening to the three of you speak. We're going to turn it over to the audience Q&A. So if our audience members want to drop any questions in the chat for our panelists, please do so now. I see a question for Alexa. Do you have a point of view on how we might galvanize employers to do advocacy for better childcare policy? In your experience, what messages have resonated with employers? What have they been willing to do as stakeholders?
Yeah, so I followed up in the chat, and really, I think that the first and foremost, especially for my employers that are, again, reaching out to me, and this is, you know, a new issue that they're just, you know, actually seeing for the first time, it's encouraging them to have that conversation. I have some folks that are a little bit, you know, more along the spectrum of getting it and seeing it and understanding it and saying, okay, what can you participate in? What are the benefits that you're providing to your employees? You know, are you participating in TriShare? Is that something that you're willing to do? I mentioned in the chat, I've had several businesses now, and they're particularly larger employees too. And I think that is an important to note, because I think that they just innately have a little bit more capacity to think about what this could look like, and kind of just sitting through and talking about what kind of options are out there for them. So if TriShare is in their region, with them saying, okay, well, here's some recent legislation coming through, and we might be able to, you know, get a childcare facility on your campus. Or we partner with, you know, another business down the street that's also having this issue. Can you work together and work with a provider of your own sort of TriShare mini pilot? You know, do you have a really good relationship with a provider that your employees are already working with, and your employees' kids are already seeing and getting care for? So I think that, you know, sitting down, I've been doing a lot of just one-on-ones, which I think have been helpful for a lot of businesses too, trying to meet them kind of where they're at, I think is really important in this conversation. Meeting them where they're at, but then also staying really persistent on getting them to keep going. Trying to walk that very delicate balance, because I think that, you know, trying to give them a lot of grace to say, yes, this is an issue, but also, yes, so what are you doing about it? And I put that in the chat too.
Great. Thank you for putting that in the chat. And I just want to flag, Alexa also put some links about TriShare in the chat as well, if our audience members want to check that out. I love your comment about meeting them where they're at, but still staying persistent on what you're pushing for. Alicia, it looks like our next question is for you. Have you seen any financial modeling that states can do to A, raise wages of workers tied to publicly funded childcare, and B, how that would correlate to increases in state investments?
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. So I would kind of break this question apart into two pieces. I think it's less of having or knowing how to create a financial model, but kind of goes back to the point that Ray made around political will. I think there has to be political will to create, incorporate wages and benefits into how providers and early educators, particularly those who are connected to a subsidy system, are paid and what that looks like. And one of those ways that I kind of previously touched on was increasing payment rates, and having a payment rate or a payment modeling that is more reflective of the true cost of care. I think that when you kind of unpack that a little bit more, those costs are going to look very different across the country. It's going to look very different within states and even within communities. But I think that another point of that would be to look more closely at how we currently define poverty, what measurements of poverty we have, to really take all of those pieces and incorporate into how wages can be increased. And I think I say that about the financial modeling not being absolutely necessary is because when we look at, and I don't want to go too deep into this because there's so much going on, but at the federal level in the Build Back Better Act, looking at some of the ways that they've built in these requirements for providers accepting children who are providers participating in the new proposed child entitlement program. And a lot of these aspects in terms of adequate living wages, access to benefits, these are built into state plans, and states are required to build in how they'll incorporate this modeling. And it also requires states to do so in consultation with stakeholders. So I think there has to be a political will. This new bill looks like it doesn't have to be political, it's going to be required to do so. But I think that a lot of states already have the tools to do these modelings, to collect this data, to collect the information and see the gap in what providers are charging versus what reimbursement rates are versus what parents can afford to pay. So I think that was what I would talk about in terms of creating a type of model. And the second part of your question about how this would correlate to increases in state investments, I think it's a both and approach. I think it's obviously going to come on part of state investment increases, but again, going back to this idea of federal investments having to undergird state investments so that there is a public system of supports for childcare, treating it as a public good that it is. It goes back to what federal investments look like as well. So hopefully that answered your question. Basically that I think it's less of like a difficulties with financial modeling and more so states being able and being willing to put up the money based on federal investments, and the federal government also putting up the money to do some of these things that are needed.
Thanks for answering that, Alicia. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But in the meantime, I have a question for you, Ray. One of the things that you mentioned during the panel was that austerity cuts hinder the advancement of racial equity. So how do you, what strategies has your coalition used to try to prevent those cuts from taking place?
Sure. Well, I mean, there are a number of different, revenue, generating sources that can be tapped into, particularly with, tax credits that, that the state currently has on the books that, don't produce the revenue. I'm sorry, tax credits that, that we're giving, to certain, certain business or other means, that aren't producing what's needed, but there are others that we can utilize that can produce more revenue that's needed to balance out certain cuts. I think, when you're just, what dominates, I guess, your fiscal strategy is by using, so many more cuts than you are as far as revenue generators. That just serves to harm those who need, that spending done the most, and also it harms those, who work in these state agencies. When you're making, these, drastic cuts in state agencies who are, and we know that, public sector jobs are, disproportionately held by those of color, and when you're cutting spending there without finding other, revenue generating sources that can be utilized to mitigate some of those cuts, it's going to harm those, who work in those, public sector fields. And it's also going to harm those who rely on those public services, which are, which a number, when we think about a number of the programs that we're speaking about right now, they're disproportionately the women and those of color. So, that's how, when I say that, austerity cuts are systemically racist, it's, when you make these drastic cuts, they're going to affect those who are disproportionately, benefiting, from that spending, those who work, in the public sector and those who benefit from public services.
Thank you for that. Are there any final questions? If not, we're going to move to a quick chat activity before we wrap up this session. So I have placed the question in the chat, but the question is, after listening to the panelists, what is one strategy you hope to replicate in your state to expand access to quality childcare for working caregivers? So if you can spend just a minute typing what you hope to replicate or one of your main takeaways from this session in the chat, that would be great. So again, the question is, after listening to the panelists, what is one strategy you hope to replicate in your state to expand access to quality childcare for working caregivers. And if you can't think of a specific strategy, then you can also just type one of your main takeaways from this session in the chat. I will give you all a minute to do that. Right, it seems like we have some takeaways in the chat. So we have collaboration to expand childcare access for workers and increasing economic stability in communities. I appreciated the point of how many childcare providers are small BIPOC business owners and how we need to find ways to support their business models. My organization is already getting ready to fund this work, but appreciate Alexa's emphasis on leveraging worker voice with employers. Working to address entrance income limits for our child care assistance program so that more families can access benefits, equitable access to child care and flexible schedules, and partnerships with industry to expand child care access. So I'm seeing a lot of themes around lifting up worker voice and partnering with employers and recognizing that a lot of child care providers are small businesses. We also have ensuring that job training meets the eligible criteria for support from the state of Louisiana. Great, I think these are all really good takeaways and suggestions. I'm going to ask that our panelists type their emails in the chat so that if people want to reach out to them, they can do so. I specifically want to call out CLASS, which has a lot of resources around expanding access to childcare. And of course, if you want to reach out to our Blue or Skillspan lead, feel free to do so. I want to thank our panelists again for the excellent discussion. I know that I learned a lot listening to you all, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join this session.